Hi, everyone. This is Jeffery Giesener for the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. And I'm with my really dear friend and almost founding participant in our group, Blima Lorba from South Brazil, and I'm in San Diego, so we're quite a distance away from each other. It's terrific that we can do something like this through Zoom. So welcome, Blima, and why don't we just get started? Letting you tell us a little bit about who you are, and then we'll go and talk about how your parents lived in the countries that they lived in before the war.
Thank you very much, Jeffery, for the invitation. My name is Blima Lorber. I live in South Brazil. I am a journalist. I am specialized in public finances, which doesn't have anything to do with Holocaust, but I am daughter of two Holocaust survivors. As you can see behind me, my father, David Lorber, and my mother, Malka Lorber. They lived in Poland, in a town in a state called Helm, which is very well known, right? And they have an amazing survival story. I'll start with my mom, Malka. Malka was born in Helm. Her surname was Miltair, right? And the family lived nearby the main square. They were 8 children in the family, 4 men, Joseph, Jacob, Chaim, Leibel, and 4 women, Malka, Mindla, Henia, Bella. Malka was the youngest. My grandfather, Berish, was a hat maker, and my mother, Bluma Negros, I think she was a very pretty woman. They were religious, so she was dressed with modesty like the religion states, right? Malka was born in May 16, 1922. She was a very sweet girl with big eyes, large eyes, black hair, and a sweet face. She had black straight hair. She learned to read very early in her life, and she wrote also very early in her life. She would rather read books and write rhymes, pieces of paper, than play with toys. She mastered in Yiddish with perfection. She wrote in English poems, short stories, and some of her stories and poems were published then in several Jewish newspapers that existed in Helm. And she was a child by this time. And a special event happened in her younger life when she was just 8 years old and in an elementary school. One of her poems was sent by a teacher to a newspaper, and it was printed with it was printed. The following week, the editor-in-chief of the periodical knocked at the family door with flowers in his hands and wanted to meet the girl who had written the poem. My mom's parents let him in and showed him the young girl, 8 years old. She was playing in the living room. So she was not a grown-up woman like he thought. My father, David Lorber, was also from Helm. He was very fond of what my mom, Malka, wrote in the newspaper, and both knew each other from a religious group for youngsters, Hashomer Dati, and they became good friends, but they were very young to get any serious commitment. My mom had dreams. She wanted to study, to graduate, to become a writer, and she wanted to play violin. She played violin very well, but all those dreams could never come true, because then the war started, right? In early September 1939, my mom was 17 years old when her dreams fell apart, crumbled, right? She and two brothers, two sisters, one sister-in-law, and two nephews, like many other Polish Jews, crossed the border to the side of the father of the nations, Stalin, right? As soon as they left, Helm was bombed by the Nazis. The group went to Ukraine, they crossed the border, and Ukraine was already taken by Russians. They went to a village there, and even in this small village, the Nazis spread bombs. On 7 October, the group returned to Helm because Helm was taken by the Russians. The Russians entered a part of Poland because of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, right? And they expected that the Russian occupation would be better, but they only stayed one night there because the Russians were withdrawing and they had to run again. It was found that there was a mistake in the pact dividing Poland, so the Russians were away and the Germans entered again.
Blima, can you just tell me a little bit about your grandparents? Do you know anything from your parents about your grandparents?
I only knew that my grandfather was a hat maker, religious one, and my grandmother was home taking care of the children.
Okay.
What I know that they didn't leave with the group, they decided to stay in Helm, and the father went with this small group that left from his children that left Helm to the border of the town, and he said, "I'm not going to see you again."
And what
And that's
about
what happened.
what about your father's parents?
My father's, pardon?
Your father's parents.
Well, I'll talk about him a little bit later,
Okay. No worries.
Now I'm focusing on my mother's, right? So they left, and my grandfather Berish really was really sad. He wanted them to stay because his thought was that what happens to one would happen to all of them. But my mother's older brother decided that it wouldn't be so. So he decided to take this group away. But in Helm, my grandparents stayed, and two of my mother's siblings also stayed, and we never heard about them again. They probably were taken to the ghetto. Somebody told my mother that my grandfather was sick and he was killed in his bed. And Helm had a ghetto. They took all people to the ghetto. Some people died of sickness, typhus, hunger, and there were several actions that took the Helm people to Majdanek and Sobibor. I'm most sure that some of my relatives really died in Sobibor. but I can't find any documents, any clue about them, right? So the group just went away to Ukraine, right? They reached the Bug River. The Bug River had to be crossed by boat, and crossing the river was illegal, and it had to be done always at night. And first, the girls went, the sisters went first, and on the other side, they waited for a couple of days for the men to come, the brothers. It took several days, but something happened. There was an incident that the boat went down, and some brothers drowned. Everybody thought it was the Military brothers, but suddenly the brothers appear on the other side of the river, right? So that was kind of unexpected. It was forbidden for the Polish refugees to live near the border. They needed to travel by train to Russia. The traveling was what we call volunteer. So if they didn't leave, they would be sent back to the Germans. So the family entered the train, and wherever the train stopped, lots of Ukrainians would invade the train looking for food, shoes, and many other things. They had money, but they didn't have anything. So my mother was really worried about it. Something strange was happening, right? My family, my mother and her siblings arrived in Moscow. So the first week they arrived in Moscow, they were taken to a place. They were treated very nice. They were given food, and they would watch Stalin's speeches and movies for the whole week, right? And when they left the room where they had eaten, Ukrainians would just come in and clean everything that was left, right? So this was, and my mother had an impression that they were not happy with how they lived there. So she said it was a strategy to treat strangers well at the expense of their own people, right? So after that, right, the family was taken to a big home. The family was lucky, especially because the women were very beautiful, right? And they started to work in a sugar mill near Moscow. This was time from machinery cleaning, machinery maintenance, and my mother was a very tiny girl, very delicate, and she had to work with those huge tools. They didn't know how to work, they learned it, right? And the Military brothers were then, after they did this maintenance, were taken as an example of good workers. And there was even news in newspaper about them, telling that they were foreigners. The communist government had given them a chance, and they were doing quite well in Russia, right? That was the view of the official press, though. After some time, the machinery maintenance ended, and they had to go farther in Russia to keep working. Otherwise, they wouldn't have what to eat, right? So they were taken away from Moscow, and now they would work in another sugar mill where it was very hot inside because the ovens were never turned. They make sugar of beets. And my mother and her sister first, they separated stained sugar, but the other workers, the women, that Russian women that were there, were jealous about from them, and they demanded that the work should be changed for the Milachtai sisters. My mother, as I told you, she was very tiny, very delicate, and she would have to carry huge bags, sugar bags on her back every day, up and down. One day she was carrying a bag and she started to cry. And one of the directors of the plant approached her and asked her who had ordered her, such a tiny girl, to do such a job. On the same day, she was transferred to another place with a better temperature and that she wouldn't work so hard. The Milachtai family received Russian passports. But next day, the NKVD, which is the political Russian secret police, collect them. They were lucky because if they stayed with the Russian documents, they could not go back to Poland anymore. Soon, they were gathered, put in a train to Siberia. When they arrived, they were taken to a filthy hut, a room that was shared with other two families with a total of 20 people, right? And it was very difficult to live in this place, but they didn't stay long there because with the arrival of new refugees, they were taken on a further journey by boat in the Siberian taiga. In this boat, there were around 2,000 people in a space of 500 people. They were sailing the Kolyma River, but the Kolyma River in that season had shallow waters, and they were trapped for nearly 20 days in this river. They couldn't move, they couldn't go on. So there was hunger, thirst, disease, death, and despair until the rain came so they could be able to go on in a journey that ended up in Tomsk. When the Germans attacked Russia in 1941, June 1941, the refugees were forced to work in the forests. My mother would cut tree trunks, tiny ones, and put them in stacks of food. Everyone had to fill out a quota. It was 12 hours per day of work, and the food that should be given, it depended on the quota of this person, how much this person had been done. Each day, my mother also did something different. She cleaned rice planting, carrots. She started to pick up cotton too. She didn't have any protection. She hurt her arms and legs, and she stained it with blood her only clothes. But she didn't have any, she had to do it, right? The person who weighted the cotton was a Russian who took interest in her because she was very beautiful, right? And always put her to the last weight to her daily production. One day he made a daring proposal to her that if she accepted, she wouldn't have to work hard. My mom was so offended that she slapped him on the face. From that day on, the harasser took revenge from her by chasing her and always marking lower weight of her production. As a result, she never was able to meet the quota and receive the minimum food. One day she couldn't stand it anymore. She filled herself with courage and explained it to the director that he believed her words, and she was transferred to a new place where she bagged silkworm cocoons. There she thought she was free from that guy, but suddenly the man appeared there too. She was terrified. But then there he was a simple worker and could do nothing with her, right? This place where they went in Siberia was a kolkhoz. They stayed there for a year and a half, and during the time they didn't see a piece of bread, which was considered a luxury in a country at war. A black bread, which was half raw, would cost a fortune. The bread was raw in order to weigh more, have much weight. The kolkhoz was made of mud, and during the autumn, it was a rainy season, the water would melt the houses and the mill collapsed. And there was no flour to make anything, bread. And despite the complaints, the Russians always said that the soldiers were also hungry. How did the refugees dare to complain, right? They were called saboteurs, and lazy. When the rainy season was over, a new work began by repairing roads, a task which was quite heavy for women because it required them to sleep outdoors on damp nights. One alarming fact that our mother told me that happened to her older brother, Jacob, he was arrested, accused of selling vodka. With great difficulty, he managed to prove that the complaint was false and foresee similar events. He decided that it was best to leave. The family was divided in two groups. The first group was my mother's brother Jacob, left for Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, to find a new home. The second group, that was only my mother and her sister Mindla, remained in the kolkhoz waiting for Jacob's return. Days and days have passed, and the two of them had nothing to eat, and they decided secretly to dig the land where crops have been already harvested in search of remaining potatoes. If they were discovered stealing, they would be arrested. They rarely succeeded in finding vegetables, even spoiled vegetables. That was the only thing they could consume. If Jacob didn't come soon, they would probably have died of hunger. But he came and they departed. In Tashkent one morning, my mom was sent to the local fair to sell a uniform jacket that was bought by one of her brothers. The sale would provide some money for livelihood. At that fair, like in many other towns, everything was sold in an effort of survival. My mom was walking with her merchandise on her arm and offering to the passerbys. She drew attention and ended up being arrested on the grounds that the jacket was stolen. Some friends saw it happen and ran to notify the family. She was taken to the police with the jacket. Nothing was said to her, and she was put in a small dark cell where she remained for 24 hours, frightening without any water or food. Soon Jacob, her brother, arrived and showed them that this was bought from an officer, and she was freed. Despite this, the house where the family lived was truly researched in order to find other merchandise that the police imagined to be stolen. Nothing was found. The family had to stay in the city for another year after the end of the war, right? Upon returning to Poland, the Milachtai settled in Szczecin, from where the brothers Jacob and Leibel decided to go to Helm in search of survivors. When they arrived, they found my father, David Lorber, who was on the survivors committee. Surprised, David asked if Malka had survived. And the answer was positive. The brothers invited him to visit them so they would meet again. However, the Milachtai didn't find any trace of the family that had stayed in Hell. After a while, my father, who was still hoping that someone from his huge family would have survived, decided to see the girl again. He went to Szczecin and sought the committee that was headed by Jacob, and was taken to their house and met Malka again, and they decided to get engaged. Jacob realized that with the change of political events, he decided that it was better to leave Szczecin and Poland, taking the family to Germany, to the American zone before the Russians took the city. Germany defeated the post-war, was divided in 4 regions of authority: American, English, French, and Russian. It was called the Board of Control, right? So after the engagement, my mom and her family left. They fled, hiding in a covered truck at night, crossing the border. They insisted that David, my father, would go with them, but he asked my mother to stay and get married. But she chose to follow her family. David stayed a few more months and became aware of what it would be if he stayed with the Russians. As he knew how the Russians acted, he was also in danger of being denounced. So he decided to flee to Germany before it would be too late. He came to the American zone, to Tempelhof, a district in Berlin, and happily it was the same DP camp my mother was in. My father joined the police group, and so he found my mother again. So they met again, and they decided to make a commitment and get married. So their fate was set. Their fate was different from the other couples that formed in those camps. While many of those couples got married, didn't even know each other before, or got just to meet themselves in the camps, my mom and dad, Malk and David, both from Helm, have known them since childhood and decided that it was better to get married, otherwise life could have also played a trick and separate them again.
How old were they when they got married?
My father was 20, I have to, I haven't figured out.
So they were in their young 20s, early 20s.
Yes, early 20s. I have to make them.
That's a very nice story. It's a very nice story, and it leads us right to the first episode. You've just done your first episode of the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm Jeffery Giesener, and we're talking to Lorber from South Brazil. She'll be right back to continue her terrific family story, and we'll learn a lot more about Blima's work that she's currently doing in researching the Holocaust. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.